It was 1980. Jimmy Carter was the president of the United States. Brezhnev was the leader of the Soviet Union, which hosted the Olympics. And it marked a milestone there. It was the last time a white guy won the 100-meter dash. But it was more than that. It was the last time any white man in the world even qualified for the finals. And that was 44 years ago. Looking at a lot of sports, black athletes do incredibly well, especially in track and field, basketball, and American football. So why? Why do black people seem to dominate sports? And is that belief really accurate? Hey, I'm Ken LaCourte. My goal is to give you an honest look here. It's not about declaring any race superior or inferior, but about what differences exist by race in sports and why. First, we'll look at whether black athletes actually do dominate sports. Then we'll check out the cultural differences at play and also look into the genetic differences, examining what the science actually says and doesn't say about racial variations in athletic ability. Now let's look at the numbers that make some people uncomfortable. Are black people really better at sports? The answer is kind of, but it depends on the sports. When we look at professional sports, it's hard to ignore some obvious patterns. About 3/4 of NBA players are black. And that's in a country where black people make up about 13% of the population. In the NFL, almost 2/3 of the players are black, but in this case, the demographics change when we look at certain positions. Cornerbacks and running backs are overwhelmingly black, while quarterbacks and kickers have historically been mostly white, although it is changing somewhat. In running, East African runners, especially those from Kenya and Ethiopia, have completely crushed marathons for decades. With only 2 exceptions, in the last 33 years, the Boston Marathon has always been won by an East African man. But flip to swimming, and you get a completely different picture. At the 2016 Rio Olympics, 45 of the 50 finalists in men's and women's 100-meter freestyle events were white. Black Americans are also underrepresented in sports like tennis, golf, field hockey, archery, softball, and soccer. Blacks make up only 5% of professional hockey players, and the U.S. Figure Skating Association reported in 2022 that 73% of its members were white, 2% were black, and 18% were Asian. Speaking of Asians, they absolutely kill it in table tennis and have since the 50s when Chairman Mao declared it the national sport. So it seems pretty clear that different races excel in different sports and play different sports to begin with. Women's gymnastics has historically been the domain of white and Eastern European athletes, but Simone Biles is likely the greatest gymnast ever, and the demographics of that sport are shifting, as well as some other sports. Okay, so that's some of the racial patterns in sports. Now let's dig into why they exist at all. One of the first things to look at is the cultural factors that shape the racial landscape of sports. It's not as simple as like they're naturally good at it. So in the 1940s, black baseball players were forced into a separate league. When that changed, we saw the depth of talent that had been sidelined. Integration reshaped the entire sports landscape, and as certain sports became more accessible to minorities, they became cultural touchstones. Basketball became a beacon of hope in many black communities. All you really needed to get better was a court. Easy to find even in crowded cities, and you needed a ball too. The game doesn't require any expensive equipment or large fields in order to play. And then there's the potential income. For many kids growing up in poor neighborhoods, sports aren't just a pastime, they're a potential ticket out of poverty. Now, when you're surrounded by economic hardship, that NBA or NFL contract is a lifesaver. And the economic incentives aren't just about the players either. Entire communities rally around local athletes who look like they might be headed to the big leagues. A successful athlete is not only a source of pride, but also investment for a hometown. So it's clear that in some communities, certain sports are woven into the very fabric of daily life. Think about how deeply ingrained soccer is in Latin American countries. And this cultural emphasis creates a feedback loop. The more a community values a sport, the more kids play it. The more kids play it, the better they get. And the better they get, the more the community values it. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy that can shape generations of athletes. There's also power in seeing someone who looks like you succeed. Role models can be game changers, and if you see heroes who look like you winning games and earning big, you're more likely to be able to see yourself in that role. I mean, sometimes we all need someone to show what's possible. Inspiration is a powerful tool. So when Simone Biles emerged as a gymnastics powerhouse, the number of black girls who began starting that sport shot up. but this effect also can be complicated. Because when Tiger Woods burst out onto the golf scene, there was an initial surge of interest in golf among ethnic minorities. But since then, the numbers have dropped off, likely due to the expense of the sport and the lack of infrastructure to let kids in underprivileged communities play it more easily. Now let's look at snow skiing, a sport dominated by whites. At the professional and Olympic level, it's overwhelmingly won by athletes from nations with more wealth and more snow. In these countries, skiing is deeply ingrained with the culture, with youth development programs and easy access to facilities. Still, however you look at it, it's expensive. The equipment, training, and access to slopes means athletes often need substantial financial backing from their families or communities to reach the elite level. Ski resorts and facilities are often located far from urban centers where minority populations tend to be concentrated in the United States. But we can't blame everything on money. Norwegians dominate Olympic sports like cross-country skiing and speed skating, and they can do those things right out their front door. Families cross-country ski and skate together, and kids start as soon as they can walk. It's ingrained into their culture. And that feeds back to the role models. A lack of diversity in skiing and winter sports makes it harder for minority youth to see themselves playing that game. Just as some sports get an entire community rallying behind them, others spark no interest in regions that haven't traditionally played them. And it's not just winter sports or expensive ones. Other fields that don't see much diversity are tennis and lacrosse, archery, softball, soccer. It's an intertwined mix of culture and economic forces at play. Okay, so given that, now let's look into the most controversial part of the whole puzzle: genetics. This is where things get really interesting and usually a little bit uncomfortable. Now, it's good to be careful here. The argument that different races have different genetics can lead to some terrible beliefs and ideologies. But it's also silly to insist that there are no physical differences between people from around the world. We should all be smart enough to look at that without getting too weird about it, but that's often not the case.
Now, I like that Jimmy the Greek moment that happens in sports, Like once every 4 or 5 years, that like some 50, 55-year-old white dude tries to explain why black people are kicking the shit out of white people in practically every major sport, And it always goes down the same way, right? And literally 20 minutes later, that dude's on TV, he's like fired, right? He's crying, his family's standing there, he's got like a box of shit from his desk with like an Emmy sticking out. He's like, I don't know what I said, I was just talking about the quick twitch and the slow twitch, and I wasn't just trying to make a point.
Anyhow, hey, this is a good time to let you know, if I make any substantive mistake in this video, I'll fix it in the pinned comment below, assuming I'm not fired by sundown. Okay, so are there genetic differences between races that contribute to athletic performance? Yes, of course, but it's complicated. Overall, there's actually more genetic diversity within racial groups than between them. But that doesn't mean there aren't genetic variations that cluster in certain populations. Scientists have noted that certain genetic traits help certain sports. For instance, many elite sprinters of West African descent have a higher proportion of fast twitch muscle fibers, which are crucial for explosive powers. These fibers contract quickly but tire more easily, making them ideal for short bursts of speed. On the flip side, East African runners, particularly from Kenya and Ethiopia, dominate long distance. Now, some researchers say it may be less about their muscle composition and more about their slim build and long legs relative to their height. That improves running efficiency. A 2010 study in the International Journal of Design and Nature proposed that black athletes have a 1.5% speed advantage in running because their center of mass is about 3% higher above the ground than white athletes. This supposedly allows them to fall forward more quickly between strides. Now, that sounds scientific, but a lot of other scientists are skeptical of such a cut and dry explanation. Another controversial idea among some scientists links the prevalence of sickle cell trait among people of West African origin to a higher percentage of fast twitch muscle fibers. But that hasn't seen a lot of solid evidence to back it up. On the flip side, look at the relative lack of Asians in sprinting events. Some researchers say this is body proportions, suggesting that the populations generally have shorter limbs relative to their torso length, which makes sprinting harder. But again, these are theories and it's kind of hard to test exactly. And then finally, let's not forget the role of epigenetics. Epigenetics looks at how an athlete's body responds to training, recovers from injuries, and responds to different environmental conditions. It suggests that while genetics might give some individuals an edge, the way these genes are expressed can be influenced by factors like training and diet, even an athlete's mindset. This could partly explain why athletes from certain regions excel in certain sports. It might not just be the genes, but how those genes interact with their environment and lifestyle. And let's not forget that genes that help in a particular sport could be a disadvantage in another. The body type that's ideal for a marathon runner is very different from what you'd want for an offensive tackle. So it's clear to say that when you look at the research, there is no clear pat answer. The relationships are science, but they're really unsettled still. But still, there are some undeniable characteristics in the most elite athletes that seems to show up in some races more than others. Of course, all of this raises the question, should we as a society be trying to change the racial makeup of competitions? I mean, certainly making all sports financially accessible to all kids is a good goal. But if you just look at the colors of those who win or those who play, that makes things a lot more complicated. And sports is full of exceptions to every rule. It may be true that some races dominate certain sports, and that isn't necessarily a bad thing. Just a fact with some interesting reasons behind it. It's similar to what I found when I tried to figure out why Arab armies almost always seem to lose against Western powers. In fact, the last time an Arab regime won a major battle against the West was in 1187 AD. And, like in sports, the answers are complicated. Hey, thanks for joining me. I love researching these and sharing what I learn with you. I try my best to be fair and hope that you come back again. Take care.